They've ruled parts of Iraq for years. Now local armed groups are being told to disband. But will these fighters listen to the government in Baghdad? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmakers are Iraq's militias. They were the heroes who helped save Iraq from Daesh. Now the government considers the popular mobilization units outlaws. Iraqi Prime Minister Adil Abdul Mahdi has ordered Iranian-backed militias to make a choice. Either continue as independent fighters who will be targeted by the National Army or join the National Army. At the same time, political parties have been ordered to cut their ties with the fighters. Now, Mahdi's predecessor tried to rein in these groups, but for the most part failed. So why try again? Well, many believe the Trump administration is behind the strategy after tensions between Washington and Tehran recently reached new heights. And while many Iraqis believe the militias provide security, others see them as local mafias. So, can the Iraqi government succeed this time around? Or do these militias only take their marching orders from Iran's generals? That debate in a moment. But first, here's Abu Bakr Shamahi.
By the end of the month, they'll either officially be members of the Iraqi army or out of a job. At least that's what the Prime Minister is hoping will happen to the popular mobilization units. Adil Abdul Mahdi has been under US pressure to rein in the largely Shia Iranian-backed militias. They were formed to fight Daesh in 2014. And on Monday, he ordered the militias, known as the PMU, to choose between integrating into the army and severing ties to political parties, or putting down their weapons altogether.
وآن الأوان لتنظيم وضع فصائل الحشد الشعبي بشكل قانوني ونظامي. هذه تضمن حقوق أبناء الحشد وفصائله من جهة، وكذلك تنظم الأوضاع الأمنية في العراق، وكل شيء تحت في إطار القوات المسلحة العراقية ولا سلاح خارج الدولة.
PMU leaders have publicly declared their support for Abdul Mahdi's order.
These decrees are not unfair, and they will boost the PMU and support its affairs. Certainly, we will respect the law.
The cleric and political leader Muqtada Sadr also backed the decision and immediately broke ties with Saraya as-Salam, a leading PMU brigade made up of his loyalists. A member of his parliamentary bloc agreed.
Today, arms must be organized and controlled by the state. The PMU and all armed factions must comply with the law and be part of the general command of the armed forces, because we must not encourage any presence of armed factions operating outside the law.
The PMU has become so influential in Iraq that an alliance made up of militia leaders and fighters came second in 2018's parliamentary elections. That's blurred the lines between parliamentary politics and armed militias. And it's perhaps a reason for Abdul Mahdi's emphasis that militias drop any political ties. But will changing uniforms and names be enough to persuade doubters that former PMU fighters will be loyal to the Iraqi state, whoever may lead it? There's a strong suspicion from anti-Iranian voices that if the PMU is integrated into the army, many fighters will still swear allegiance to Iran. There are also links between many of the militias and Iran's Revolutionary Guard, an entity now designated by the US as a terrorist organization. Tensions between Iran and the United States have been increasing in recent months, and there have been several attacks on US forces stationed in Iraq over the past month. Militias have been blamed for one of the attacks, but no one has claimed responsibility. And yet, for many in Washington, the finger is pointed at Iran, as the fear grows stronger that Tehran is getting even more powerful in Iraq. Abu Bakr al-Shamahi, the Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now in Washington, D.C. is retired Iraqi Army Brigadier General Ismail al-Sudani. He was also Iraq's defense attaché to the United States from 2007 to 2009. In Baghdad is Professor Rahman al-Jabouri. He's a senior fellow at the American University of Iraq. And also in Baghdad is International Relations Professor Ali al-Nashmi, who teaches at Mustansariya University. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Rahman al-Jabouri, let me start with you. So we have the Prime Minister, Adil Abdul Mahdi, making the call, signing the executive order, telling the popular mobilization forces, you have to be absorbed into the army. Is it easier said than done? Is this going to be difficult?
Let's start with this is a brave steps from the Prime Minister for the executive order or the ministerial order. Implementation of such order is going to be a huge challenge for the Prime Minister. First, on two fronts, I think myself. One is embedded or integration of the BMF in the military right now will kind of put us in two dangerous two-way in this way. First is the army itself is weak right now. The commander of the army is not going to control a political elites who are controlling the Iraqi scenes of politics right now. Mm-hmm. That's one. Second, if the BMF put in the army, that means the army is going to be controlled totally by the BMF leadership. So we're having a two challenge. The Prime Minister, what he has to do, first, he has. Oh, sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So we'll look at what he has to do with the challenges a little bit later on. But it's good to get where you all stand on this right up front. Ismail Sudani, these groups have been given immense power over the years, from the time of Nouri al-Maliki to the recent fight against Daesh and so on. They effectively control the streets in many towns and cities across Iraq, and they have strong allegiance to another country. This is going to be a problem whether they agree to get absorbed into the army or not, right? Because as has been mentioned by Rahman, if they're in the army, they control it.
I would like to say that those fighters or those units who participated in the fight against ISIS should have been recognized and shouldn't be demobilized without any containing solution from the government. So from one point, this decree or this order was extremely beneficial for the political scene in Iraq, because we do not want the armed forces or the security apparatuses to be part of the political process inside Iraq. This is first. And second, reintegration is so important for them to be part of the security forces. So we may have used them as a paramilitary forces to fill the gap between the policing and the military missions in the future. But the question now is the reintegration, or is this decree is enough or good enough to reintegrate them, and they will be submitted to the government command and control? This is very huge question, and I doubt, in my perspective, within these 8 items has been produced by the Prime Minister office, there are many loose ends in this decree, if I would say, need to be addressed in a proper way, so we can see practically or technically this could be accomplished or achieved in the near future and the long-term future.
Yes. If you're a militia leader who has been given tremendous power and there's been no accountability, because in the fight against Daesh, there were scores of reports of atrocities against civilians, especially Sunni civilians and so on. No accountability, immense power, you control the streets. Why on earth, General Sudani, would you want to get integrated into an army where you're going to have to face accountability? They wouldn't want to do that, would they?
I agree with you that if we can maintain this political power over these units, many of these fighters have answered the fatwa 2014, and Iraqi government did not have any other option because Iraq was on the brink of the collapse. So there was no any other option unless mobilizing the people to stop ISIS from what they have done. And fortunately, they were very successful to drive ISIS out of the Iraqi territory. But the question is, after endorsing or passing the paramilitary or the Popular Mobilization Forces law from the parliament to 2016, the government at that time should have started the reintegration process with a very clear regulations. So first of all, they have to be disconnected from the military. Should have been disconnected from the political affiliation that they are reporting now to.
Right.
So it's an overdue implementation of the law,
right.
And the Iraqi government shouldn't do the good job to reintegrate them at that time.
Ali and Nashmi, is the bitter reality that these groups, these 140, 150,000 men have more loyalty to Tehran than they have to Baghdad? That's the reality, whether you like it or not.
No, I think since not all that groups they follow Iran, because the majority they are coming after the fatwa of Mr. Ali al-Sistani. And but after that they connect with or link with other groups. That groups they follow Iran, the leaders, but the fighters, not only the majority. This is you should understand it. Not all the fighters as the leaders of that groups. You can say the majority of that groups, they are follow Iran. But the fighters, they are coming by the order from Iran or those leaders. But they are coming after, according to the fatwa of Ali Sistani, they follow Ali al-Sistani. And you must know, and you should know, the ideology of Ali al-Sistani, it's different than the ideology of Iran. In order that, I think, when you're talking about the popular mobilization, you should shift, or you should separate between both the groups.
Okay.
In order that, when they link with the army, I think we will find people, they are ready to be soldiers in the army. Right. Not only they will refuse or they still follow the Iran, but we need a term for training. Those people need training because they are militia. They are not soldiers. We need at least 6 months. After that, you must link it with the army.
But Basta Nashmi, if people look at the modern history of Iraq, you had the Iraqi army who had proper soldiers training, who ran away when Daesh were taking over towns and cities and villages, whereas these people who didn't have the proper soldiers training defeated Daesh. So that training doesn't do you any good, does it?
No, I don't mean we should training them to be good soldier. We are talking about training to be a soldier, to be a part of the army. It's not they are a part of the militia. This is I am talking training to be a soldier, not training to be to still a militia. This is I talking about. And also the situation when the collapse of Al-Mosul is different. I will give you just one example.
Sure.
The majority of those soldiers who escape from the army or going to their home, the majority of them, they return to the army as a militia. And they fighting very good fight as a militia, but they escape from ISIL from the...
So maybe the organization of the army wasn't as good as it is right now back then, but I don't want to go down that route and discuss that fully. Rahman Al-Jaburi, there was an interesting mini documentary made on Vice recently. Militia leaders, for example, Hashim Al-Mayahi, who's a senior military commander of Asaib, one of the militias in the PMF, telling Vice News, if there's a war between the US and Iran, we are signing up to fight the Americans. It's interesting because I wonder, has the momentum for all of this come from Pompeo's visit? Has this come from the Americans? Are the Americans telling the Iraqis, you need to sort this out immediately because we don't want the Tehran-aligned militias in Iraq turning their guns on us and fighting a battle against us. Is that where it's coming from?
This is part of it, not the whole truth. The truth is the war on ISIS is over. The Iraq need a national army with a legion for the country and under the national, command, in chief of in command or command of chief. The reason now is there is two ways again to see it. One, that Iraq is trying to find its way and not to be target for the American because of these groups. So the prime minister is under the influence of the Iranian, try to integrate them so they are really kind of hidden within the army itself. So there is no militia. That's one reason. The other reason, I think the Iranian themselves think this is an opportunity for the militia that we train. They are loyal to us, to embedded with the Iraqi army. So then it is kind of enjoying the state resources, enjoying the state protection, and fighting under the state if we want them. You know, my both colleagues talk about it. Some of the people will be their loyalty always for their religious leaders because they came from a religious background. They recruited according to their religious fatwa. So when we talk about this, it's also need what kind of training we have. It's not a military training. It's not put them in a boot camp. It is really about the loyalty. You need to integrate these people for a long period. You need to mix them with the army first, and then you have to have a new training inside the army. When you have this is a project of 2 years to 3 years to engage these people, to cut the connection with the military, with the political leaders and the religious group. So that's a long reform kind of a process to get to that point.
Okay, so General Soudani, deep fears that you're going to have soldiers with a greater allegiance to another country than your own country. Let's try to imagine that you're given a battalion of these new recruits who were formerly part of the Shia militias. You have to take care of, I don't know, 500 of them. What do you do? How do you ensure their loyalty, and how do you ensure that they're not going to turn their guns on you and that they're going to be loyal soldiers to the Iraqi state?
Imran, I told you that this degree itself has lots of loose ends and need to be tied up. The reintegration processes is very arduous, long, lengthy, and tough procedures, and required a professional, higher community in Iraqi government to be formed in order to put the strategies to reintegrate these people. Those people are ideologically motivated and politically affiliated to political parties. And this is the dangerous part of reintegration, how to disconnect these fighters from the political influence. As you know, any democratic country should have keeping their military apparatuses away from the political affairs or political affiliation in order not to get any trouble in the future with the military institutions. So I wouldn't, I'm not going with your assumption to have 500, fighters from these units to come under my command, because I would be overwhelmed if they wouldn't have rehabilitation program before they have been distributed to the units and merge and melt up with the military units, maybe with the police, maybe with the counter-terrorism. Maybe we would form kind of, a prototype of National Guards in the United States.
Okay.
Or
that's a good point.
German.
And I'm glad you mentioned this because it shows the complexity of trying to sort this out. Ali al-Nashmi, we saw what de-Ba'athification did to Iraq. It was a mess. When you had people part of an organized structure and that's just dismantled, it becomes chaos. this might be similar, right? Because as was mentioned by Ismail Sudani, it's not just fighters. These are political players who control the streets and control governance in many parts of the country. How do you actually do this?
I think the picture, it's not like this. It's if you're focusing deeply, we can find many differences between what you're talking about, Pakistan, and between what's happening after the ISILs. Now we have two crises in Iraq. The military crisis and we're talking about the democracy crisis. They are mixed now in Iraq. When you're talking about the military side, that happened in the democracy side. Then when you're talking about when you shift or you different or you change what they are before and put it now in the state as a new, I think it's different. The Ba'athists and
right.
Because the Ba'athists,
I wasn't giving a direct comparison, but I was saying when you dismantle something that's very organized, it's not as easy to absorb it into something else, is it?
No, I think it's more easy, because I told you the majority of those fighters. I will tell you frankly, they are not always ideologicals. The majority that are coming because there is no job in Iraq. He said, I will come with a popular mobilization to take a salary because he don't have any job. The majority of them, 90% of them, they go to that work to follow the Al-Fatwa, and even there is national work. In order that when when the state give them a job with salary, I think they will as the state needs. We must focusing in this case. They are very simple people.
Right.
They need job. They aren't salary.
This is a good point that you make.
When they put them in the army, I think it's better.
Right, okay. Yeah. This is a good point to make. And it's going to be an interesting test to see how this absorption happens. So far, not much resistance to disbanding as militias. So far, we're seeing all of them on board. But how this works is going to be fascinating. Gentlemen, I'll talk to you once again sometime soon, but I've got to move on for now. Ali Al-Nashmi, Rahman Al-Jabouri, and Ismail Al-Sudani, thanks again. Israel hasn't declared war on Syria, but try telling that to the families of the victims killed in airstrikes just a few days ago. Syrian state-run media says Netanyahu's forces killed several civilians. The attacks from both the air and sea targeted several military installations. And while they are covert operations, we know this isn't a new development. Israel's army has admitted to bombing 200 Iranian targets in Syria since 2017. And while Israel says it's merely protecting its borders, we want to know who's accountable when innocent people are killed. With more, Haider Abbasi reports.
Syria calls this state terrorism. It accuses Israel of launching airstrikes near Damascus and Homs. 15 people were killed, including children. There's been no response from Israel. Iranian positions were targeted, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. And it's not just Syria that's angry about the strikes.
Iran has been and remains our ally and partner with whom we consistently develop our relations, both bilateral and multilateral, which means any attempt to portray Tehran as a threat to regional security or bring it in line with ISIS or other terrorist groups is unacceptable for us.
Israel has been carrying out attacks in Syria for years, even before the current conflict began. But since the war started in 2011, those missile strikes have escalated, and that's because of Iran. Since at least 2012, Iran's military and the Lebanese group Hezbollah have been fighting with Assad's forces in Syria. But Iran's support goes deeper. It's been supplying technical support and training Syrian soldiers. Tehran has also been propping up Syria financially. It's spending at least $8 billion in aid every year. Israel believes Iran and Hezbollah are creating a new front against the state of Israel. And it won't be stopping the strikes anytime soon.
And will continue to act in Syria to prevent Iran's effort to militarily entrench itself against us. We're not going to reduce our efforts, we're going to increase our efforts.
But could Israel's strategy against Iran backfire? And can it continue to attack Syria and in the process angering the regime's allies without being drawn further into the war? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from West Jerusalem is former Israeli government spokesman Yuri Dromi, who worked under the administrations of Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres. He is also a retired Israeli Air Force colonel and is now the Director General of the Jerusalem Press Club. In London, we have journalist and commentator Danny Makki, who specializes in Syria's relations with Russia and Iran. And from Washington, D.C. is Syrian affairs analyst Ruwan Al-Rajoulah. Good to have you all on the program. Yuri Dromi, let's start with you. So it's quite clear that Israel targeted Iranian facilities in Syria, at least that's what they claim. 15 killed, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, 6 civilians, including 3 children. Was it a necessary strike? Was it worth it?
Well, we always regret the loss of lives of people who are not involved, and we go out of our way to avoid it. But unfortunately, when you need to strike a target and the target is situated in an urban area, and this is a big strategic threat to Israel, then we need to do it. And again, we regret the loss of lives of uninvolved people.
When we look at the theater of war, is it Israel versus the Syrian regime and its allies, or is it Israel versus Iran and it happens to be in Syria?
I think the second option is more relevant to the situation. We have no feud with the Syrian regime as long as our border is safe. And of course, we are targeting the Iranian plot to establish in Syria a advanced stronghold, which will further destabilize the area, like the one they already have in southern Lebanon with the Hezbollah.
So, Danny Makki, besides Iran defending Assad and ensuring Assad's survival, is the threat as serious as the Israelis make it out to be, that the Iranians have these massive installations that they have long-term designs for to use as launching pads against Israel?
Well, it's a very complicated situation. I mean, you'd argue that the Iranian forces in Syria are plentiful and that they're scattered all across the country. They're not just in one province. So it'll be difficult to say why Israel, for example, isn't hitting targets further away than Damascus in the southeast of Syria, which is quite a small pocket in regards to different provinces much further away. So you'd have to argue that these areas which the Israelis are targeting are really minimal in terms of what potential damage they could do to Israel, because a lot of the facilities being struck are ending up with Syrian soldiers being killed. So it's a tough one to really say that Israel is directly fighting Iran in Syria when a lot of the casualties, a lot of the locations being hit in and around the capital are actually Syrian military as opposed to Iranian facilities. There are Iranian facilities, but they're further away than Damascus. You couldn't say that all of them are located around the capital. So you'd have to argue, just to what extent these strikes are really minimalizing the power of Iran in Syria. I think it's very small, to be honest. I don't think they're having any real effect on Iran's capacity to use Syria as a battleground in the future.
Ruwan, tell me a little bit about the effectiveness of these strikes.
Yes, it's the question of effectiveness. The effectiveness is how much this military action is really serving a political purpose. Yes, it could be effective if you're targeting warehouses, ammunitions, but what does it serve on a political level? What is Iran? What is Israel's interest in Syria in terms of Iran? Do they want to contain Iran? Do they want to eliminate Iran? Do they want to push Iran out? Because it's not going to be only a question of the Iranian presence in Syria, but also I would look to Iraq. Back to the military action. The biggest and the most huge aerial campaign that Israel conducted was in May 2018, and they actually took officially responsible for that, and they bombed it everywhere. Now it's been a year. I would ask, what was the political gain from that? I am favoring, targeting surgical targets for Iranian pockets, but what about the Iranian military camps in other places? So the effectiveness is really related to the bigger picture.
Yuri Dromi, can Israel get to pick and choose? Can it get to pick off Iran when it wants to with airstrikes and still say, well, we don't really want to get involved in the war in Syria?
Well, as was said before, it's very complicated. Nobody can operate in Syria without bumping into somebody that maybe they didn't mean to bump into in the first place, because it's the regime, it's the insurgents who still have some say, it's the Russians, of course, and then other forces. But Israel has no reason to quarrel either with the Syrian regime or with the Russians. It's only Israel is only trying to do in a surgical way to harm the attempts of Iran to establish in Syria a aggressive stronghold, which will then affect not only Israel but probably other countries in the region like Jordan and others. So we try hard to do it as much as surgical as we can, but sometimes it's very difficult to do so.
Yuri Dromi, game theory, if you were on the other side, if you were the Iranians, what would you do now?
Yeah, well, it's difficult to go into the minds of the Iranians. I would take the signals of Israel seriously, because you remember when the Russian plane was shot down, and there was a strong Russian reprimanding Israel, etc. And still, last week, top Israeli, Russian, American defense official met, and Israel can still operate. So if I were Iranian, I would take it seriously.
Yeah, that's interesting, because in Jerusalem, the Israelis, the Americans, and the Russians all sat together discussing the region. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in that meeting. Danny Maki, the Syrians hit back. It wasn't a massive strike. It was a little sort of retaliation across the border. Would the Assad regime only have done that after consultations with the Russians and the Iranians? You can retaliate, but not too much?
Well, the Russians are heavily vested within Syria, and they're heavily vested in first of all, keeping the peace between Syria and Israel and maintaining a level of control over this particular environment. So I doubt the Syrians would really do anything significant without consulting the Russians in some sort of way. Obviously, they have joint command centers in Latakia, and they liaise on almost every diminutive topic or issue which happens in the area. Now, the main issue here is that there has been a response from the Syrians, but it's not really proportionate to the level of the Israeli attacks which happened. And if you take a timeline chronologically of how things have occurred, since the downing of the Israeli jet by Syrian air defenses, then the downing of the Russian jet by Syrian air defenses after the Israeli attacks in Latakia, we've seen very fierce Russian reactions to these events. And that has been portrayed in the sending of the S-300 missile system, which we haven't seen so far. And a lot of sources within Syria actually say that the S-300 isn't even online yet, so it wouldn't be participating. But one thing is certain, and if you see the statements of especially the Russians in the aftermath, that they're investigating the situation, this will really reap no benefits. The Russians don't want to upset Israel or push it any further, and they're quite happy with the Iranians being hit in different areas. The Russians' main problem is they don't want pressure to be building on them from Damascus, which kind of feels that it's just being attacked purposely on almost a weekly level for no real reason. So I think that if the strikes were more clearly against Iranian targets, rather than, say, Syrian civilians being killed or Syrian soldiers being killed, then that would be more justifiable from Damascus's viewpoint.
Danny, address the point that Yuri was making, right? So he's saying that this is a very forensic strike and it's pinpoint and so on. And yes, you're going to have civilians who die in the theater of war, but these are very specific Iranian installations being targeted. Why don't you fully accept that?
Well, it's difficult because if you look at the area which was targeted for the most part, which is an area called Jamraya, it's actually surrounded by about 50 different compounds being used by the Syrian army and next to residential houses. So it's very difficult to surgically strike any of these areas around a city as inhabited and as congested as Damascus, which is why if you're striking T4 airport in the middle of the Syrian desert in Homs, you can clearly identify that, okay, it's not going to be a residential area. But in areas such as Damascus, which there's so many people there, it's really difficult to have any surgical strikes. We know that the civilians were killed through obviously the air defenses being fired and then falling back down. But this is a risk that Israel takes every single time it targets Syria.
Can I just say something?
Sure.
Look, first of all, we need to talk about the context. It seems like Israel is bullying the whole region. It just goes out there bombing at will. We're targeting we are facing a threat, a strategic threat that the Iranians are building, not only in Damascus, not only in Homs, and Danny is right, and we're striking all these places where they are building their capability there. And second of all, with all due respect, after Assad himself, with the Russians, bombed their own people, the Syrian people, for years to pick on Israel, I think it's a bit ridiculous.
Yuri, I just want to ask you in terms of going after the Iranians, if the thinking is, and Netanyahu is a firm believer of this, and it's a separate topic to be debated, Netanyahu is a firm believer that the Iranians are going after nuclear weapons, right? Is the thinking right now, beyond Syria, but with Lebanon and elsewhere, now's the time to hit the Iranians before they have a nuclear deterrence? Is that the thinking?
No, I don't think the Syrians' attacks are related to the Iranian atomic or nuclear scheme. And by the way, we just heard Rouhani himself saying that they're going to enrich more uranium than they were allowed in the big deal that Europe is insisting on holding. So Israel has a big issue with Iran on the nuclear level, but these strikes in Syria are more related to the second level of the Iranian aggression in the Middle East, and that is building wherever they can, whenever they can, islands of insurgency,
proxies,
aggression.
Right.
Look at Saudi Arabia. Look at Lebanon.
Okay.
And we are fighting it.
Okay. Ruwan Rajula, come here, just fold your answer into this question. Is Israel, by hitting the regime and hitting the Iranians, doing the Syrian opposition and the Syrian revolution a favor by weakening them?
Before answering the question, I just want to make a comment about the strategic threat that Israel is seeing. And rightly so, there is a strategic threat with the Iranian presence in Syria, but I would argue it's not really the presence of the military bases or the militias, because as the general knows, the Iranians are wearing the Syrian army uniforms. So there are infiltration of the Iranian-backed militias, whether they are Arabs, non-Arabs, inside Syria, and they are actually on the borders. So I don't know how much are the Israelis comfortable that their borders, especially in the south, are really protected, because how would you know when you are bombing them from the above? So I would argue the strategic threat is not really now; it's on the long run. And if I wanna do the game, the war game, and being in the Iranian mind, Iran, the Wilayat al-Faqih, has been there since the 70s, and they endured all kind of sanctions. And for the last few years, they have been controlling 5 Arab capitals with minimum and very cheap costs, which is, backing up, Arab and non-Arab non-state actors. So I don't think Qasem Soleimani or, any commander, IRG's commander on ground did not see in their calculations the Israelis' attacks, and they are ready for it. So I would argue that the presence of the Iranian in the intel, in the Syrian intel, in the Syrian army, and the bureaucracy, and also on top of that, the demographic changes that Iran has been carrying for so long. So it's not a matter of opposition. Of course, the Syrian tragedy had played to it very much. But I think Israel, with those airstrikes that are targeting civilians, they're even losing, both sides, especially taking into consideration the deal of the century that Israel and other regional allies are trying to build. You cannot really promote among Syrian people that you are for peace while you are bombing, with no plan, with no political solution. You're just an aggression. So I think Israel, in a way, is losing that message, especially, and it's counterproductive for whatever efforts are being there for the success of the deal of the century, a peace with Israel.
Okay.
So no, I think I kind of disagree with the general.
Okay. I've got to move on, but it's been good to talk to all of you. Looking forward to having you back on the program. Rawan Rajoleh, Danny Makki, and Yuri Dromi, thanks so much for joining us.
To be able to be here and send off commercial whaling ships for the first time in 31 years is something that I think is very emotional for those who have been working for it to be resumed. And I'm happy from the bottom of my heart.
Japan has resumed commercial whaling after a more than 30-year moratorium, though critics say it really wasn't much of a ban. The government withdrew from the International Whaling Commission last December. Tokyo says hunting the animals in a sustainable way will help the economy and will see tourism bounce back after a devastating tsunami in 2011. But environmentalists aren't convinced and point out that even under the ban, 17,000 whales were slaughtered. Let's talk more about this with the president and CEO of the Humane Society of the United States, Kitty Block. She was one of the architects of a successful lawsuit over commercial whaling brought against Japan in the International Court of Justice. Also with us is Finn Holm. He's a Japanese whaling expert and an environmental historian at the University of Zurich. Good to have you both on the program. So, Kitty, commercial whale hunting is back in Japan. It's kicked off. I'm guessing that's in the inhumane camp from your perspective. Tell me how you feel about this.
The days of commercial whaling should be long gone. There are only just a handful of nations that are still killing whales for profit, Japan being one of them. This is a big setback, not just for the animals, but for the nation and for civil society. These are not Japan's whales. These are the world's whales, and we need to protect them.
There's an argument, Kitty, that they were once close to extinction, but not anymore. That's why it's maybe more okay to do so.
Well, in the heyday of commercial whaling, 8 out of the 10 species of whales that the international body oversaw were commercially extinct. We don't know how many whales are out there, but we know that commercial whaling is not good for the animals. And when there's profit involved, it always puts too much pressure. And in fact, some of the whales that Japan is taking, the sei whales, they are endangered. And so to be honest, we actually don't know how many whales are out there. So that to say that there's enough, it doesn't ring true.
Finn Holm, is Japan doing the wrong thing?
It's very difficult to say. The Japanese government says that there are enough whales around. So they assure that they would never take more than 1% of the stock that is currently in their waters out of the sea. But as Kitty just said, we just don't know how many whales really there are. And especially sei whales is very unsure how large the stock actually is.
Yeah, Kitty, some people who've looked into this say that there's not much demand for it, or not as much demand for it as there used to be in the past, especially when it comes to eating whale meat. That's something that the older generation had an appetite for, but not so much the younger generation. Does that encourage you?
It does, and it is something that if you see and what the numbers are, it is the older generations. The younger generations are not really consuming it. They don't have a taste for it, and they don't really, quite frankly, want to be associated with it. And so it is quite literally a dying industry. But what is exciting is that there is a fledgling whale watching community in Japan. And some of those very communities where whaling has taken place. So that's really encouraging, and I think that if we can focus on something, that would be the way to go. That would be what we would focus on.
It's pricked a lot of Japanese nationalistic sentiment, the criticism over whale hunting, even when there was a moratorium, Kitty. I don't speak Japanese, but the little Japanese criticism that I have come across that has been translated has been something along these lines. This is part of our culture, it's our tradition. The Norwegians do it and other countries do it. Why are you picking on us? Why are you attacking our culture? Address that for me for a second.
Well, the countries that are still whaling, Iceland, though I will say that they, for the first time since they returned to whaling, they have suspended their commercial whaling. Norway has been whaling. They took an objection to the moratorium back in 1982 when it was passed. And so they have been whaling. They have been subject to criticism, both Iceland and Norway. But most of the criticism, I think you're correct, has been leveled at Japan because they were bound by the moratorium after they withdrew their objection. They were bound by the moratorium. And instead of honoring it, they turned around the next day and went so-called scientific whaling, research whaling. And of course, market their meat, the meat of these animals ending up on the market. So I think there was the criticism around that, sort of the disingenuousness. And also for decades, Japan was whaling on the high seas in the Antarctic. And there was a Southern Ocean whaling sanctuary there. So they were actually whaling in a sanctuary that raised the ire of so many civil society and nations around the world.
Finn Holm, when the Japanese had said that we're doing this for scientific purposes, for research purposes, when we look back at it now, is it absolutely clear that they were just lying during that time?
I wouldn't say that. I think the Japanese were very upfront with what they want to do with the research whaling. And this was to assess how many whales there are so that they could, at one point in time, restart commercial whaling. That was always the purpose of scientific whaling, to restart commercial whaling at one point. And they made that very clear. But it is true that the scientific whaling was started immediately after the Japanese did not withdraw in the 1988, but they did not make an objections against the moratorium because they were pressured by the US to not do so.
I want you to have a little listen to the Japanese with regards a quota or a cap. Have a little listen, Kitty, and I've got a question off the back of it.
We want to continue whaling in the future in a sustainable manner. The quota that has been released is something that would not affect resources for 100 years. So we will follow the quota and continue to hunt.
So, Kitty, tell me why you don't believe them.
Well, it's not a matter of not believing them. It's the problem of commercial whaling. And this was not just unique to Japan. Again, in the heyday of whaling, the nations, including New Zealand, the US, many nations, nearly obliterated the animals in the ocean. It comes down to, it's very difficult to know how many animals are out there. When there's profit involved, the pressures skyrocket. These animals are long-lived and slow to reproduce. They are not suited to this, and in fact, there's no humane way to kill a whale at sea. And so there's just a whole host of problems. And it's just saying that you're going to work to keep the numbers low, that's an interesting point, but low to what? We don't even know what's out there. And some of the stocks they're talking about in their coastal waters, which is a J stock, not to get too technical, but that's a separate, distinct stock from other minkies. So it may even be more problematic on some of the whales in their coastal waters. And I will say that whales are highly migratory, and they pass through, majority of them pass through Japan's exclusive economic zones. So hunting them in these areas, it's a problem. It's a problem not just for the animals coming through, but it's a problem because it's all the whales.
Right. And when we look at the numbers, 70,000 whales were killed under the ban or under the moratorium. So when you think that the shackles are off now for commercial whaling, what kind of numbers are you thinking about in terms of the whales, the number of whales that will be killed in the years to come?
Well, you know, it's anyone's guess what we're going to see. But not being tied to this international body anymore that had the best marine scientists in the world, without those checks and balances, it's scary to think of what can happen to these animals. Whaling outside of the international body, the IWC, International Whaling Commission, that has jurisdiction over whales up to a country's shoreline, is to go whaling, it's pirate whaling, it's renegade whaling, it's whaling on your own at a time when countries need to be cooperating with other nations to conserve these incredible leviathans. So it's so important not to go off on your own now, not to be a renegade pilot whaler, but to join the international community to conserve these animals for future generations.
Kitty Block and Finn Holm, good to talk to you both. Thank you for joining us. That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.